So it's only, I know, touching fringe, calm down, it's alright, that's the last. So it's only 12 days to go to Christmas, and I don't know about you, but I can't wait. Anyone who knows me knows that this is my favourite time of year, absolute favourite time of year, and I look forward to it from January the whole way through. And this year there's two things I'm excited about. I'm excited about next week. Where's Elizabeth Devlin? I cannot wait to see your costume. I've been hearing good things. I've been hearing her costume's going to be good, so I am excited to see what everybody's going to be dressed up as next week. The other thing I'm excited about is that Santa must have slipped down our chimney early this year, and he's left a big box beside the fireplace belonging to Emma. We don't know what's in this big box, but we're hopeful it's a puppy. So we're waiting to see. We're waiting to see what's in Emma's big box. So that's what I'm excited for this year. But Christmas isn't just my favourite time of year. It's also one of my favourite stories in the Bible. It's probably one of the most famous stories ever told. Everybody knows about the birth of Jesus. And every year, whenever my daddy asks me to speak at Christmas, I sit down and the same thing happens. I sort of think, right, what am I going to get out of this story this year? Because it's a story that we've all heard so many times. We've seen nativity plays, we've sung Away in a Manger and Silent Night. Everybody knows the story. So every year I sit down and try to think, what can I get out of this that's a wee bit new and a wee bit different? Something that I've never seen before, something that can bless me and bless the church. And every year there's always something that catches my attention, because that's the good thing about the Bible. Even if you've read a story 100 times before, if you look at it again with a heart that's open and a willingness to learn, then God can show you something new through it. And this year what we've been looking at is the whole journey from Mary finding out she's going to have a baby right up to Bethlehem. We looked at the road to Bethlehem last week, and what I want to do is just talk about three things that have sort of stood out to me on that journey, three things that helped me, and I've just called this Making It to the Manger. So that's the title of today's message, Making It to the Manger. So what I learned when I looked at this story again is that it started with a surprise. Christmas, the very first Christmas story started with a surprise, and that's the way every Christmas should start. It has to start early in the morning, waking your mommy and daddy up at 6:30 in the morning, them shouting, get back to bed, you saying no, we're going downstairs. It has to start early in the morning, running down the stairs in your pyjamas to see what surprises you've got. And if you're one of them people who gets stressed or who waits till after dinner to open your presents, then you've been doing Christmas wrong all these years. You have to start with your surprises. And for Mary, that first Christmas definitely started with the biggest surprise of her life, when an angel appeared to her and said, you're going to have a baby boy. And you can read about it in Luke chapter 1, verse 28 to 38. And it said, Gabriel appeared to her and said, greetings, favoured woman, the Lord is with you. Confused and disturbed, Mary tried to think what the angel could mean. Don't be afraid, Mary, the angel told her, for you have found favour with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus. For he will be very great, and he will be called the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David, and he will reign over Israel, for his kingdom will never end. And Mary asked the angel, but how can this happen? I am a virgin. And the angel replied, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the baby to be born will be holy, and he will be called the Son of God. What's more, your relative Elizabeth has become pregnant in her old age. People used to say that she was barren, but now she's in her 6th month. For nothing is impossible with God. And Mary responded, I am the Lord's servant. May everything that you have said about me come true. And then the angel left her. So it started with a surprise. The thing to remember about this story is that Mary was maybe only about 15 or 16 years old when this happened. So she's not exactly planning on a baby just yet. She's maybe thinking, whenever we get married, whenever we're settled down, yes, one day it would be great to start a family, but not just yet. So to see an angel appearing and telling her she's having a baby was a massive surprise. And it's a double surprise, because she finds out that her cousin Elizabeth is pregnant as well. And Elizabeth, she was at the opposite end of the spectrum, because she'd been ready for a baby for a long time. She was married to a priest called Zechariah, and they had served God faithfully. They had worked in the church and they'd been faithful to God, but they'd never been able to have a family of their own. And they were both well on in years. They were both getting old, and they're probably thinking, well, now it's too late. Elizabeth's probably thinking, I'm too old now, I'd have loved to have been a mummy one day, but for some reason it just didn't happen. And that must have been hard, especially back in those days, because if a woman couldn't have babies back then, people used to whisper, people used to look, people used to wonder, what's going on there? Why is that not happening? So you've got people maybe looking at Mary, and people maybe thinking, too soon for her to have a baby, too young. You've got people maybe looking at Elizabeth and maybe thinking, it's too late and she's too old. But here's the thing, God surprised them both by saying, you're going to have a baby boy. And where you have a surprise, you've always got somebody who's put planning and who's preparation into giving that surprise. And God had this all planned out for a very long time. He said, this is the time that I've chosen. It's not too early for Mary, because when he looked at Mary, he seen someone who was willing to serve him, even though she was young. And it wasn't too late for Elizabeth, because when he looked at Elizabeth, he seen someone who'd been patient and who had served him faithfully. So God's timing was perfect, and he had it all planned out for a very long time. Way back even in the Old Testament, an Old Testament prophet, Isaiah, talks about the birth of John, which was Elizabeth's son. God had this all planned out because Elizabeth's son John was meant to be born and prepare the way for Mary's son Jesus. And this was all organised from years and years before, when Isaiah said, listen, it's the voice of someone shouting in the desert, clear the way through the wilderness for the Lord, make straight the highway through the wasteland of our God. That was talking about John, because the whole plan for his life was to go out into the desert, was to speak to people and to tell them there's a Messiah coming, the Son of God's coming, and you need to get ready, you need to get right with God. And that was prophesied about years and years before. So God had it all planned out. God had it all organised. And how does that help us? What's that got to do with me and you? Well, to me, it shows how in control God is of every single situation. He planned that entire story out long before it had ever happened, because one baby boy, John, was meant to prepare the way for the other baby boy, Jesus. And if he can do all that, then you and me can be reassured that he can handle and he is in control of any situation that comes into our lives. He's never caught off guard thinking, oh my goodness, what do I do now? I didn't see that coming. No, he is always in control and he always has a plan. Jeremiah 29:11, it says, for I know the plans that I have for you, says the Lord, and they are plans for good and not for disaster, and they are plans to give you a hope and to give you a future. He knows the plans. He knows what's going to happen down the line. He has everything in his hand, and all our job is to do is to trust him and to follow him and to remember that he is in control. So where you have a surprise, you have somebody who planned it, and that very first Christmas started with a surprise. The second thing that I noticed about this story is that Mary stopped to sing. Mary stopped to sing. A very wise man called Buddy the Elf one time said that the best way to spread Christmas cheer is singing loud for all to hear. And at Christmas, you have to have singing. Christmas would not be the same without songs. Me and Emma actually took a drive up to the airport last week just to sing Christmas songs, because why would you not? What else would you be doing? What else would you be doing during lockdown? If you haven't done that, you need to, because it'll put you in a good mood. But you know what? And the Open Door has started singing as well. They've ordered a Justin Bieber CD. So Janine has learnt all the words. Justin Bieber Christmas CD. Janine's learnt all the words, and they're getting into the festive mood down there as well. But that very first Christmas had singing in it as well, because Mary, she goes to visit Elizabeth for 3 months, and at some stage within that 3 months, she stops to write a song. She stops to give her praise and give her worship to God. And you can read about it in Luke chapter 1, verse 46. It says, Mary responded, oh, how my soul praises the Lord, how my spirit rejoices in God my Saviour, for he took notice of his lowly servant girl, and now all generations will call me blessed. For the mighty one is holy, and he has done great things for me. He shows mercy from generation to generation to all who fear him. And you can go on and read the whole song. And this is part of the story of Christmas that sort of often gets forgot about almost, or doesn't really get focused on. To be honest, I've never really focused on it before, but Mary is completely amazed that God has picked her. She says, you've picked a servant girl, and you've exalted me, and you've chosen me. And she takes time out of her day to write a song and to give God her praise and to give God glory. And you know what? Sometimes it's important for us to stop what we're doing and sing to God. Sometimes it's important for us to stop and give our worship and give our praise to God, and to remember the good things that he's done for us. Why? Because when we do that, when we get into that place of worship, when we get into that time of praising him and remembering how good he is, it focuses our attention, and it focuses our eyes again on who he is. Takes your focus away from whatever it is you might be worrying about, whatever has you distracted, whatever has you stressed out, and it puts your eyes back on Jesus, back on the one who's bigger. And when you focus on how amazing he is, when you focus on how powerful he is, suddenly the things that you're worried and distracted about don't seem so big anymore. You remember that my God can handle this, my God can take me through this, my God can get me through whatever situation I might face. And this year there's probably been a million and one reasons to get distracted. There's been a million and one reasons to get worried. Am I on furlough this week? Am I back to work? Are my kids at school? Are my kids off school? What's the rules this week? Are we allowed people in the house? Are we not? Everything's changed so much. It's been a crazy, crazy year. But in the midst of all that, if we can find time to stop when you're in your own, in the car, in the house, in your living room, wherever it may be, put on some worship music and focus again on who God is, then in that place, He can touch your heart, He can bless you, and He can meet with you. Because when you make time for God, He makes time for you. He always has time for you, but when you say, God, I want to come and I want to worship you, then He blesses you with His presence. He blesses you with meeting with you again. Chris Tomlin says that worship isn't where God isn't moved by the quality of your voice, but the condition of your heart. That quote doesn't apply to me because I have a lovely voice. But worship is not, I'm only joking. Worship is not about how well you can sing, but worship's about the quality of your heart. And when God sees a heart that says, Lord, I want to remember the good things you've done, I want to focus this time on you, then He meets with you and He blesses you in that time. Why else is worship important? Well, because when you worship God, it can actually be a blessing to somebody else. Your song can bless somebody else as well. There's a big church over in New York, and it's called the Brooklyn Tabernacle, and they have this big, massive choir, and it's a choir that has won Grammys and wrote loads of famous songs. They've done really, really well, but that's not how it started out. The big famous choir that you see today isn't how it started out. It started out as a group of working class people who had maybe been ex-drug addicts, ex-alcoholics, people from broken homes, all the rest of it, and they came together and they decided to start a choir and sing to God. And the girl who started the choir was called Carol, and she was the pastor's wife of the church, and she just had a desire to sing to God. She just had a desire to worship God and to get people together. And the choir and the songs that they have written have had a massive impact on people's life. The girl who started the choir wrote a book, and it's called He's Been Faithful, and I read it. I've only read about 6 books in my life, but this is one of the best books that I've ever read. It's very, very good. And she tells some stories about how the choir has impacted people's lives, how the music has changed people's lives. And I'll just read a really quick story to you, and it's about a man called David. And he says this. David says, I was a drunk, living in an abandoned truck. I've been homeless for a number of years, lucky I guess to be alive. One morning, as I was sitting on the stoop at the back of the church, finishing off a bottle of wine, I heard a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. It came from inside. I could hear the singing and the clapping, and though I can't remember the name of the song, it seemed like a calling from God. It was like He was telling me that this might be the last chance that I would ever get to come into His house. Even though I was afraid that people would reject me because I was such a filthy mess, I went inside, and that's when I heard a woman telling how God had solved her problem with drugs. Everything she said was exactly what I needed to hear. I needed the Jesus that she was talking about. Without Him, I knew that I would die in the streets. The music I heard that Easter Sunday helped to save my life. And after that, God got a hold of me and He brought me to Himself and He cleaned me up. Now I have a wife and a good job at the church. One of the songs that has affected me most is one that Carol has written, and it's called Holy Like You. The words express so much of what I want my life to be like. I used to think that the only thing I wanted was another drink or more drugs, but now I only want to be like Jesus. And to me that shows how a song, how worship, how taking the time to give praise and give glory to God and say, Lord, it's all about you, can completely change somebody's life. Because a choir stopped to sing and made space in the service to worship God, that man's life changed forever. So what can God do through our life, through our worship in here? He can touch hearts, He can change people, and He can heal the broken when we stop and sing. So when I looked at the Christmas story again, the first thing I learned is that it started with a surprise. The second thing I learned is that it's good to stop and sing. And the last thing that I learned is that it's about staying humble. It's about staying humble. So Mary goes and she stays with Elizabeth for 3 months, her cousin. And the next part of the story is what we talked about last week, where Mary and Joseph have to travel to Bethlehem to get registered. Joseph's originally from Bethlehem, and everybody has to go back to their hometown to get registered because there's a census taking place. And we talked all about that journey last week. I'm going to take water because my mouth's getting dry. And whenever I've looked at that story, or I've seen that story in plays or in films, you always imagine that Mary and Joseph got to Bethlehem right at the last minute when Mary's about to have a baby. You always imagine that they're running around, knocking on doors, trying to get somewhere to stay, knocking on all the hotel doors. Have you got a room? Have you got a room? We need somewhere to stay. You imagine that it's almost like this panic until finally they find a kind innkeeper who says, I've no room, but you can stay out the back in the stable with the animals. And that's how we always picture the story. But I did homework at this, and I looked into the history of it, and that's not exactly how it happened. It's close, but that's not exactly how it happened. You see, the Bible doesn't even mention an innkeeper. There's no innkeeper in the Bible. So I'm going to have to give Nelson a different part in the nativity play next year, because he was supposed to be my innkeeper. The Bible doesn't mention an innkeeper, but here's what we do know. We can read about it in Luke 2. Here's what we know about when Mary and Joseph got to Bethlehem. It says, and because Joseph was a descendant of David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He travelled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee, and he took Mary, his fiancée, who was now obviously pregnant. And while they were there, so that gives us a clue that there wasn't this mad rush, there wasn't this crazy, quick, get in at the last minute. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. So they were there a few days before, a few weeks before, maybe a few weeks after, we don't know. It says she gave birth to her child, to her first child, a son, and she wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth, and she laid him in a manger because there was no lodging available for them. Or what the King James says is that there was no room at the inn. There was no room at the inn. And here's what you need to know about this story. This story that we're reading today, it was written by Luke. And Luke originally writes his book in Greek. And the Greek word for inn is kataluma. That's what the original language was, Greek, and the Greek word for inn was kataluma, and that meant guest room. It didn't mean hotel, it meant guest room. What does that matter? Why is that important? Well, you see, back in them days, a typical house in Bethlehem would have had a wee living area at the front and a big guest room up the stairs, and then out the back, most Bethlehem houses had like a wee alcove or a wee cave with a manger built in where you would have kept your animals in case someone came at night and stole them. So when Mary and Joseph got to Bethlehem, what most people who study Bible history tell us is that they weren't looking for a hotel, they weren't unorganised. It was a 70-mile trip like we learnt about last week. So you don't take a 70-mile trip with a pregnant woman without a wee bit of planning. So what most people who study history tell you is that they tried to get into Joseph's family's house. They think that Joseph had family back in Bethlehem, and that's where they tried to stay. But when they showed up, the kataluma, the guest room upstairs, was full. So Mary and Joseph had to stay out the back. Bethlehem was busier than usual because of the census, so the guest room was full. They already had people staying, and so Mary and Joseph had to stay out the back where the manger was built in to a wee alcove or a wee cave or a wee area where they kept the animals. And what's important about that? Well, what that showed me is that it was a lot more humble than where you would expect a normal king to be born. There was no look at me, there was no pride, there was no arrogance. When Jesus came, he came humbly. Where he was born was probably the most humble place he could have ever been born in. See, humility, it's not about thinking, oh, poor me, everybody's better than me and I'm no good at anything. No, humility is when you know who you are, but there's still no pride and no arrogance about you. It's like if someone's a really amazing footballer or a really amazing singer, but there's no pride and no arrogance in them. And Jesus knew who he was. He knew he came from heaven. He knew he was the Son of God, but there was still no pride and no arrogance in him. When the kataluma, when the guest room was full, he was humble enough to say, I'll be born out the back. There's one other time when we read in the book of Luke where he uses that word kataluma for guest room, and it's whenever Jesus was getting ready to have his last supper with his disciples, and we can read about that in Luke 22. Jesus is getting ready to have the last supper, and he tells his disciples, I want you to go and get a room ready. And it says, Jesus sent Peter and John ahead, and he said, go and prepare the Passover meal so that we can eat it together. Where do you want us to prepare it? They asked him, and he replied, as soon as you enter Jerusalem, a man carrying a pitcher of water will meet you. Follow him, and at the house he enters, say to the owner, the teacher asks, where is the guest room? Where is the kataluma? where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples, and he will take you upstairs to a large room that is already set up, and that is where you should prepare the meal. They went off to the city and found everything just as Jesus had said, and they prepared the Passover meal there. So here you have Jesus in a guest room. It's nicely decorated, nicely furnished. He's upstairs in the Cataluma. What does he do? He still stays humble. He gets down and at the meal and he washes the feet of his disciples. So all throughout his life, he stayed humble and he served. From the very first room that he entered, when there was no space for him, he stayed out the back, right to the very last room that we ever hear of him being in, right till his very last meal. He says, I'm still willing to serve. He said in Matthew 20:28, I didn't come to be served, but I came to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. When he came, it was selfless and it was humble. When he grew up and he ministered, and he touched broken people's lives, he healed people with leprosy, he reached out to people that society had rejected and told were no good. It was selfless and it was humble. When he had his last meal, he got down and he served his disciples by washing their feet. It was selfless and it was humble. And when he gave up his life for you and me on a cross, he did it in a way that was selfless and it was humble. He is the humble King. On my message last year, Christmas, I quoted a song, and it's funny, I was listening to it last Christmas and I was listening to it coming up to this Christmas as well, but the words of it get me every time. It says, you're the God of the broken, the friend of the weak, you wash the feet of the weary and embrace the ones in need. And I want to be like you, Jesus, to have this heart in me, for you are the God of the humble, you are the humble King. And to follow that example of Jesus, to live selflessly and to say, do you know what? I'm not going to be prideful, I'm not going to be arrogant, I'm willing to serve and I'm willing to do what you have asked me to do. To me, that's why he came. And to me, that's what Christmas is all about. It's not about what we can get, it's about what he gave. Yeah. So what I learned about the Christmas story this year is that it started with a surprise. God is a planner, he's always organised and he's always in control. Mary stopped to sing, and when you focus your attention on God, it'll bless you, it'll touch your heart, but it can also bless others. And the last thing that I learned is that Jesus stayed humble, and Christmas is all about staying humble. It's about worshipping a God who was willing to come and to offer his life for us. That's everything. Thank you.